The wind tasted of iron and wet earth, and it moved through the ruined farmhouse like a whisper that knew every secret. October 13, 1943, Verdun sector, France, pre-dawn. Sergeant Samuel Carter, 30 years old, crouched under a sagging roof beam with the muzzle of a rifle that looked more like an accusation than a tool. Mud clung to his boots. The smell of burnt canvas and spent primer stuck to the back of his throat. Around him, Private Louis Grant rubbed his numb hands. Corporal Frank Meyer pressed a map flat with trembling fingers, and Lieutenant Helen Sloan checked lenses with a miner's patience. The weapon in Carter's lap was not the standard issue. It was longer, heavier, and it thumped with a recoil that made the men call it names in whispers. The standing orders said no to weapons that shattered bones more than targets, yet here it was, assembled from schematics smuggled out of an ordnance depot and forgotten until a supply crate appeared on a rainy night. 6 months had reduced their company to a number on a list and a row of graves. The math of survival had teeth. 27% of the assault teams sent in the last 2 months returned with less than half their squad intact. The standard rifles hit targets, but could not break the new concrete sandbags that the enemy favored. If that rifle worked, if its shot could punch through barricade and wreck a machine nest, it might change that arithmetic. If it failed, it would only add to the account of losses and give the bureaucracy another reason to say no. Samuel Carter felt the weight of that equation in his shoulder and chose to see the rifle as a hinge. If you like stories of prohibited tools and risky choices that altered the small gears of war, consider subscribing so these forgotten decisions are remembered. The routine of loss had a blunt cadence. Men left in the night were listed by number and by name, and the ledger never forgave the living for its pounding. In the barracks, the bunks were lined like a cemetery with turncaps and blankets and the smell of soap scented to hide fatigue. Captain Arthur Reed recited casualty percentages at roll call, and the numbers settled into the men like bruises. Private Tomas Ruiz had been in 3 patrols and counted jokes as if they were currency. He joked less now. Corporal Isaac Moreno stitched patches with hands that no longer shook as much, but could not stop touching the scar above his eyebrow where shrapnel had remembered his face. Major Charles Whitaker argued at headquarters that doctrine should not bend to panic, yet met the families of the dead with hands that trembled behind a clipboard. The company had lost 32 men in the last 6 weeks across 2 engagements. That number was not only a statistic, it was the reason Carter kept waking at pre-dawn with the taste of metal in his mouth. He kept a small ledger in his pocket with names and the places where they fell, and sometimes at night he traced the letters until the paper was worn like a map of memory. The field reported more than bodies. There were muffled cries that became background noise, a slow erosion of optimism, and the steady presence of fear that found its way to the bones. The account of losses was not abstract. It was a chorus of empty bunks, letters that never arrived, and mothers who would learn to fold their grief into neat shapes. The technical diagnosis made plain why the standard arms failed. The enemy had moved to layered defenses, combining sandbag revetments with thick timber frames and metal plating salvaged from wrecked armor. The M1903 and the newer semi-automatics had velocity, but not the mass behind the projectile to fracture layered armor at useful ranges. The new concrete sandbags functioned like compression springs, absorbing the bullet's energy before it reached the interior supports. Ordnance reports called it ricochet and spall, and listed equipment losses in columns of ink. The prototype rifle that circulated in rumor had a substantially larger bore, and fired an experimental heavy round with a sabote that retained shape until impact. Its design traded rate of fire for penetrating momentum. The trade-off was recoil so violent that early tests had injured shooters and bent standard mountings. The ordnance manuals recorded 3 incidents where shoulder bones were fractured and 1 where a technician broke his wrist on the bolt. But the same reports also showed a line where a single shot had cut through a reinforced embrasure, leaving a jagged hole and a stunned crew inside. The engineers, like Dr. Evelyn Park, who had worked on the round, used terms like momentum transfer and hydrostatic shock, and wrote diagrams in small, precise handwriting. The problem was not that the idea was unsound, it was that institutions disliked weapons that created a different kind of cost from the habitual kind. Samuel Carter had a childhood that did not predict a flirtation with forbidden arms. He grew up in a factory town where the foundry whistle measured days. He learned to read by tracing the pitted metal of gears, and to measure time by the pattern of soot on his father's hands. As a boy, he collected stripped parts of radios and carved them into models that did not exist. His father taught him to respect craft, and his mother taught him to argue with careful sentences. At 16, he left for the Navy, and then transferred to the Army, where he found the discipline tested his knack for making things work. In training, he was never the fastest, but he was the one who could mend a broken sight with wire and patience. At 26, he lost a friend named Daniel Price in an ill-conceived raid, and the loss settled into his chest like a stone. He vowed, after that, to treat equipment not as icons, but as promises to men who depended on them. The factory boy who listened to metal taught him to hear a weapon like a machine, to be coaxed, not worshipped. When he saw the prototype in a rain-soaked supply crate, he recognized the same pocked metal he had grown up with, and felt a private obligation to make the tool an ally rather than a weapon of random harm. The backstory continued in the fragmentary years that followed as Carter learned ordnance by watching and asking questions. He volunteered for engineering detachments and learned the language of recoil springs and recoil buffers, and of how small changes in weight distribution could turn a weapon from dangerous into usable. He wrote notes in the margin of manuals and saved diagrams that others threw away. After Price died, he kept a list of names in his pocket, and when he examined a worn barrel, he imagined the face of the man as if the rifle were a ledger of promises. The past taught him that rules were necessary, but not sacred, and that sometimes a device outlawed by paper could still serve a living man. That lesson sat heavy behind his ribs as he looked at the prototype for the first time and wondered whether to be loyal to doctrine or to the men who awaited a change. When Carter spoke in the shed where the men worked on the rifle, it was not the voice of a fanatic. He gathered Corporal Meyer, Private Grant, Private Ruiz, and Dr. Evelyn Park, who had come from the Ordnance Depot with a thin smile and a notebook. The conversation lengthened into a sequence of exchanges that resolved into practical decisions. Carter said, "We test at first light." Meyer said, "That recoil will break someone." Carter said, "We will brace the stock and use a delete from the bipod." Park said, "The buffer will need to be modified." Grant said, "If it breaks a man, we bury him." Ruiz said, "I would rather die trying than die waiting." Park said, "I can add a recoil spring, but it will reduce velocity." Carter said, "Then we balance." Meyer said, "Who signs for this if it goes wrong?" Carter said, "I do." Grant asked, "Are you sure?" Carter answered, "As sure as I can be." The tone moved between dry technical terms and a grim humor that tried to keep the fear from curdling into panic. The men talked tools and bones, and the conversation was both a negotiation over metal and an argument about what they were willing to risk for a different future. The discovery of the prototype had its own theater. It came in a crate stamped with an old depot number and a handwritten label smudged by rain. Captain Reed first wanted to turn it over and forget it. Major Whitaker wanted paperwork. Lieutenant Sloan had the eyes of someone who read an instrument and saw both hazard and possibility. Private Grant had a superstition about new things in the field and called the rifle a demon in jest until his voice thinned. The scene inside the ruined barn was thick with smell of oil and wood dust and the faint, tinny sound of a harmonica from a man trying to pretend to be indifferent. Carter lifted the receiver and ran his fingers along the rifling with a mechanic's reverence. It gleamed with a kind of dangerous hunger. He felt in his palms the history of ordnance and the possibility of rewriting a tactic. The decision to keep the weapon was not just about metal. It was a moral choice that split the company into those who would trust bureaucracy and those who trusted survival. The modification sequence was intimate and dirty. They removed the standard stock and fitted a reinforced slab of birch wrapped in canvas to serve as a buffer. They replaced the bolt head and counterbalanced the barrel with lead rings removed from old ballast. Dr. Evelyn Park measured chamber pressure with careful notes, while Meyer filed a notch that would reduce muzzle climb. Sensory detail cut through the work. The smell of hot metal as a file bit steel, the taste of soot on their lips, the rasp of sandpaper on wood, the shock of cold when a tool slipped and bit the palm. They worked through night using a lantern whose yellow light made every face look ancient. Dialogue kept the method alive with 6 and at times 8 exchanges as the team ran through checks and argued about tolerances. Park said, "That gauge reads high." Meyer said, "Then file." Park said, "If we file too much, the pressure will vent." Carter said, "We cannot afford a dud." Grant said, "What if it tears the shoulder?" Ruiz said, "Then it tears my shoulder, not yours." Carter said, "We test at 20 meters." Park said, "I will log everything." Meyer said, "You will be my witness if I cry." Laughter came, and then silence, and then the rhythm of hammers and files. The first test was a ritual and an experiment, and the barn held every sound like a confessional. The first firing sequence was a tension carved into time. They set a target of stacked sandbags with a timber support behind to simulate an embrasure. The air smelled of burnt primer and rain. Light from the lantern flickered across faces turned pale and tight. Carter braced the rifle while Grant steadied the bipod, and Meyer held a cloth against his lips as if to catch his breath. The trigger clicked. The recoil snapped like a tree root and forced air from lungs, and for a heartbeat everything was loud, then quiet. Then a new sound filled the barn, the sound of wood ripping and sand spraying like a forgotten storm. The hole punched through the fortification was jagged, and the timber frame behind splintered into fingers. Dr. Park stepped forward and touched the edge of the breach as if checking temperature. She said, "This is not a myth." Meyer said, "It will change angles." Grant said, "Can we repeat it?" Carter said, "We will." Dialogue counted out in a steady 6-exchange cadence recorded more than technical observation. Park said, "We need records." Carter said, "I will sign them." Meyer said, "We will train the men." Grant said, "We will keep it hidden." Carter said, "Until we need it." The barn odor of oil and sweat and the echo of splintered wood became the baseline of a small, improbable hope. The first use in combat came a week later on a ridge where the enemy had placed a machine nest controlling a shallow valley. Sensory cues threaded the moment. Cold seeped through layers of clothing, the scent of bracken and diesel mixed at the edge of the valley, and the sky was a tight blue. The squad moved like careful ghosts, with breath forming small clouds that fogged into the light. Carter and Meyer and Grant and Ruiz and 2 others, Jacob Haynes and Leo Novak, moved into position. They spoke softly in 6 to 8 exchanges that were equal parts prayer and instruction. Carter said, "Wait for my signal." Meyer said, "Watch the left flank." Grant said, "Do not fire until the tracer crosses." Haynes said, "I have the rope." Novak said, "The charge is set." Ruiz said, "Ready." Carter said, "Now." The rifle barked and the round struck the embrasure with sound like a small thunder, and then silence, and then the enemy position erupted in confusion. The initial victory was not clean. It cost them light and earned them opportunity. Men who had huddled in the depression stood up with empty eyes and raised hands or raised weapons, and failed. The miracle was immediate and then bureaucratic. Rumor spread faster than paperwork. By the 3rd day, men were whispering about the rifle that could break concrete and grant you angles that maps did not provide. Requests trickled up and then spilled into formal letters. Lieutenant Helen Sloan received passes, and Captain Reed fielded memos, and Private Tomas Ruiz heard his name attached to a story he had not yet owned. The effect on morale was measurable. Patrol returns improved by 14% across the next 2 engagements, and the account of losses thinned to numbers that did not preface every sentence. But this victory created new lines of pressure. Major Whittaker received an anonymous envelope with a photograph of the prototype and a note suggesting that any unauthorized ordnance would be punished under military law. The officers argued over liability and precedence, and the company watched the proceedings with a mixture of gratitude and dread. The institutional response landed like a weather front. Major Whittaker called Carter to tent, and the scene was heavy with the smell of coffee and the paper of orders. Whittaker leaned over the map table and said, "This was never sanctioned." Carter said, "It saved lives." Whittaker said, "Rules exist for reasons." Carter said, "Those rules were killing men." Whittaker said, "There will be consequences." Carter said, "I signed for it." Whittaker said, "Not properly." Lieutenant Sloan stepped in and said, "The men respect him." Captain Reed said, "We are not reckless." Dr. Park had already written a short dossier on modifications and results and placed it on the map like an offering. The conversation extended into 8 exchanges with both steel and plea. Whittaker said, "If it becomes policy, there are legal implications." Sloan said, "If it is suppressed, more will die." Reed said, "We need a trial run before command." Carter said, "Let me show you on the ridge." Whittaker said, "You will be under escort." The tension in that conversation was equal parts moral and administrative, and the men felt a cold permission structure close around them even as it hinted at tacit protection. There were 3 moments of slowed tension that etched themselves into memory. The first moment was the night before the ridge assault, when Carter sat by the slain window and traced Price's name in the condensation with a fingertip. He remembered the way Price laughed and the way trenches smelled in summer. The memory filled a paragraph and unspooled like a film of what he stood to lose. The second moment came when Dr. Park measured the pressure gauges and reported a reading that was higher than expected. For minutes no one spoke, and the barn settled into a held breath. The technical possibility of catastrophic failure hung like a tight wire. The third moment arrived during the final firefight a month later, when Carter felt a sharp pain in his shoulder and had to make the decision to give the rifle to Grant or keep firing. Each of these moments stretched time into small eternities, 2 to 3 paragraphs each, and demanded choices that were both petty and enormous. The final confrontation that became the cost of the whole operation occurred at a crossroads held by an enemy force that had reinforced with anti-tank plating and metal sheeting scavenged from wrecks. They planned an evening assault, and the weather turned to a thin rain that made every surface glisten and every step louder. The squad moved in with a suppressed tension, and dialogues shaped the fight into an almost formal choreography. Carter said, "Hold the line." Meyer said, "The left flank is open." Grant said, "I can cover." Ruiz said, "Watch the slope." Haynes said, "I see movement." Novak said, "Ready." Carter said, "Fire on my mark." The rifle produced a sound that changed the geometry of the fight, and then Samuel felt a wrenching pain as the recoil tore his shoulder. He did not fall. He passed the weapon to Grant and watched the trajectory of the next shot puncture the enemy plate and collapse the machine nest. The cost was visible. Carter's shoulder would never regain its old range. Later, in a field hospital, the surgeon would name nerve damage and list the complications on a form. The strategic result was measurable. The enemy withdrew from the ridge, and the valley remained open for the next supply convoy. The squad kept 10 more men alive that month, and those saved men would later testify to the value of the decision in interviews and in letters. But there was also an accusation filed by an adjacent company claiming unauthorized use of ordnance and a cold staff meeting where the file was opened like a blade. The aftermath rippled for months. 1 month after the initial use, the company had reorganized and the immediate tactical advantage had been consolidated. Supplies reached forward and the front lines shifted in small increments. The men who had used the rifle returned to guard duty and wrote letters. Private Tomas Ruiz wrote home in cramped letters describing the terror and the odd pride of survival. Lieutenant Sloan filed a preliminary report balancing technical findings and witness statements. The public story was sparse, and the regiment recorded the event as an unorthodox action with limited citation. 3 months later, a formal inquiry had begun. Major Whitaker was called to headquarters, and Dr. Evelyn Park received a curt commendation for technical ingenuity tempered with a warning to obey protocol. The inquiry listed benefits but emphasized risks and potential liabilities, and the dossier became a document that both praised and censured. 6 months out, the prototype had been sent to a depot under guard, and a limited number of modified pieces were authorized for experimental units with strict reporting requirements. Samuel Carter, who had been recommended for a decoration, received instead a transfer order and a confidential note that implied both thanks and a subtle edging away. The public memory did not include his name. The rifle entered a category in the files marked conditional utility, and the ordnance manuals were amended with a paragraph about recoil management and training requirements. The epilogue stretched into years of memory and misattribution. In interviews, Captain Arthur Reed recounted the Ridge action and emphasized the teamwork and the choices while omitting certain details that would have drawn legal scrutiny. Private Grant wrote to the regimental archive and described Carter passing the rifle with blood on his sleeve. Dr. Park published a paper in a narrow journal about recoil mitigation with discrete references to field trials. Major Whitaker kept the inquiry file and buried it among other redacted reports. For decades, the rifle existed as a footnote in a supply ledger until a graduate student named Claire Beaumont found a tucked-away crate label and requested access to the depot photos. She traced cartridge numbers and matched them to the field report, and in doing so, pulled a thread that revealed not only the engineering process, but the moral choices that made it live. Museums received pieces that were catalogued under experimental ordnance, and the narrative around them softened into technical curiosity. Survivors, like Jacob Haynes and Leo Novak, told their grandchildren about a night when a single shot made a valley safe enough to cross. Samuel Carter, who never sought credit, lived out his life with a shoulder that reminded him daily of the cost. He would receive visits from veterans and from historians who asked for his account and journals. He would, in small, quiet ways, correct the records or add a name, and sometimes he would refuse to be photographed. In the memory of combat, there are things that papers do not capture, and there are names that never make headlines. The rifle that was too powerful for routine use changed angles, it saved lives, and it broke a man, and it broke an assumption about what institutions were willing to risk. It became part of a patchwork of improvised solutions that multiplied into strategy, because men decided to trust craft over strict compliance. If this story moved you, consider writing Ars Caria, or follow the rules in the comments, and explain why you chose that word and how you think institutions should balance doctrine and human life. Sharing your view helps others see multiple perspectives and fuels future episodes where we dig into records and voices that history almost lost. If you value research narratives about small innovations that made outsized differences, subscribe to the channel. We bring documents, interviews, and first-person accounts so those choices that saved or cost lives do not vanish into a ledger. Some weapons are forgotten. Some choices are not.